Thank you for clicking in this video. Are you ready to confront the unknown? Stick around to unravel the mysteries and face the fear that hides in plain sight.
New York City is a place where myths blend with the mundane. Among the skyscrapers and relentless hum of traffic, a different kind of silence lingers in the shadows of Central Park, a silence whispered in late-night conversations between those brave or foolish enough to listen. It's said that a woman in white appears at dusk, roaming the paths of the park, her figure almost spectral. She stands alone, her pale dress flowing like mist, her eyes dark pools of mystery. They call her the Lady of Shadows. James Hargrove had heard the legend many times. As a photographer for a local magazine, he thrived on uncovering New York's hidden secrets, things others dismissed as urban lore. He was always on the hunt for stories that would stir the public's imagination. His latest assignment, however, seemed more personal. The editor-in-chief had nudged him toward it with an almost sinister smile. Take a picture of her, James. People love ghost stories. It'll sell. But behind the casual tone, James detected something else. A challenge. Or was it a warning? Intrigued, and more than a little skeptical, James began his research. The Lady of Shadows had been seen for decades, but her appearances were erratic. Some claimed she only emerged when the park was bathed in twilight. Others said she came out when the moon was at its fullest. Witnesses were unreliable at best. No one had managed to photograph her. Most people dismissed the idea as superstition, but the few who believed described a haunting experience. One moment they saw her, and the next, they woke up somewhere in the park, hours lost from their memory. But it wasn't the lost time that scared them, it was the feeling that came afterward. As if something vital had been drained from their soul, leaving them hollow. James didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in fear. People could convince themselves of all kinds of things. He told himself that whatever was happening could be explained rationally, some shared hallucination, a trick of the light, maybe even a prankster dressed in white. That's what he thought as he made his way to the park one cool autumn evening, his camera slung over his shoulder. Central Park had always held a certain allure for him, the sprawling greenery a stark contrast to the city's chaotic pulse. But tonight, there was something different in the air. A chill that wasn't just the approaching winter. The trees seemed to close in as the light faded, their long shadows twisting on the ground like fingers reaching for him. James chose a path not too far from the main roads, but isolated enough that he wouldn't be disturbed. He needed quiet if he was going to capture anything worthwhile. His feet crunched on the gravel, each step echoing unnervingly in the stillness. The usual sounds of the city, horns blaring, distant conversations, seemed muffled, as if he'd stepped into another world. He set up his equipment near a bench overlooking one of the park's many secluded areas. As the minutes ticked by, his mind began to wander. He thought about the witnesses he'd interviewed, their nervous glances as they recounted their encounters. One woman, in particular, stood out. Her eyes had been wide with fear as she spoke about the emptiness she felt after seeing the lady. "It's not just that you lose your memory," she had said, her voice trembling. "It's like you lose a part of yourself." James shook off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He didn't believe in such things. But he was here to capture the truth, whatever form it took. And if he managed to debunk the legend, even better. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the park in shades of blue and gray when he saw her. At first, it was just a flicker in his peripheral vision, a flash of light. His heart quickened, but he kept his focus steady. Slowly, he turned his camera toward the movement, his finger hovering over the shutter. He scanned the area, and there she was, standing near the edge of a small pond, her back turned to him. Her dress was old-fashioned, the kind worn in another era, and her long hair fell over her shoulders like a veil. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if she had materialized from the mist itself. James swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He was about to take the shot when something strange happened. The air around him seemed to still. No breeze, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet that pressed in on him from all sides. And then, as if sensing his presence, she turned. He froze. Her face, though distant, was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those eyes, were like black holes, drawing him in. For a moment, he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His thoughts became a jumbled mess, as if his mind was being sucked into the void of her gaze. And then everything went dark. James woke up hours later, his camera still in his hands, the park now bathed in the soft glow of street lamps. His head throbbed, and for a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or why he had come here. Slowly, the memories returned, but they felt fragmented, incomplete. He had seen something, someone, but the details were slipping away like sand through his fingers. A deep sense of dread settled in his chest. He felt empty, incomplete, somehow. And then he noticed his camera was still turned on. The lens had captured something. He stared at the small screen, his hand trembling as he scrolled through the photos. There, in the last frame, was the Lady of Shadows. Her eyes stared back at him. James couldn't tear his eyes away from the image on his camera's screen. The Lady of Shadows stood frozen in the frame, her white dress illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. But it wasn't the ethereal nature of the photograph that unsettled him, it was her eyes. They bore into him, two dark, endless abysses. He felt a creeping chill run down his spine, as if her gaze was still alive, watching him through the lens. Shaking off the lingering unease, James quickly packed up his equipment and left the park, his mind racing with thoughts. As he walked back toward his apartment, he couldn't stop thinking about the feeling of emptiness that had settled in his chest. He had experienced the stories he'd heard firsthand. The strange void left behind after seeing her, the lost hours, everything had happened just as the witnesses described. But none of them had captured a picture. He had proof. Once he was home, James uploaded the photo to his computer. The screen flickered to life, and there she was again, haunting and unyielding. He stared at the image for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it. Her figure was blurred at the edges, like smoke caught in a breeze, but her face was disturbingly clear. Her eyes, her hollow, empty eyes, seemed to pull at him, drawing him into a darkness that made his stomach churn. Still, the photographer in him marveled at the shot. It was eerie, captivating, everything his editor would want. But something about the image bothered him. The longer he stared at it, the more he felt like something was wrong, something beyond the strangeness of the legend. He tried to dismiss it as nerves, or maybe the adrenaline from the encounter still surging through him. He glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. He had lost hours, just as the stories said. A wave of exhaustion washed over him, the kind that doesn't just come from physical exertion, but from something deeper, something that seemed to gnaw at his very being. James saved the photo to a secure folder and decided to leave the rest for the morning. Maybe a good night's sleep would clear his head and bring some clarity to the situation. As he lay in bed, though, the feeling of emptiness only grew. It wasn't just emotional. It felt physical, as though something vital had been taken from him, leaving him hollow, incomplete. His mind kept replaying the moment she turned toward him in the park, those eyes locking onto his. The thought that he had somehow captured more than just an image gnawed at him, but eventually, exhaustion claimed him, and he drifted off into an uneasy sleep. That night, James dreamed of the park. He wandered the same path, but the sky was darker, the trees twisted and gnarled. The shadows seemed to move, creeping closer with every step. He could feel them watching, waiting. And then, in the distance, he saw her again, the Lady of Shadows. This time, she was facing him, her face shrouded in darkness, her form blending into the shadows around her. In the dream, he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot as she slowly, almost deliberately, glided toward him. Her dress whispered along the ground, a soft sound that seemed to echo in the silence. As she drew closer, James realized with growing terror that her face was no longer human. Her eyes, the black voids he had seen in the photograph, had expanded, consuming her entire face, leaving nothing but darkness. She reached out a pale hand, her fingers impossibly long and thin, and touched his chest. The touch was cold, so cold it burned. James tried to scream, but no sound came out. The emptiness inside him grew until it felt like he was being pulled apart from within, consumed by the same darkness that filled her eyes. He woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The sensation of her cold touch lingered, a phantom pain that refused to fade. He sat up, rubbing his chest where she had touched him in the dream, half expecting to find frostbite or some other mark. But there was nothing. Just the overwhelming sense of dread that hung in the air like a fog. James threw off the covers and stumbled into the living room, still disoriented. He needed a drink, something to calm his nerves. As he poured himself a glass of water, his eyes flicked to his computer screen. The photo was still up, the Lady of Shadows staring back at him, her expression unchanged. He felt a shiver crawl down his spine. Something was different about the image now. He couldn't quite place it, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight tilt of the head that hadn't been there before. His rational mind screamed at him that it was impossible. A photograph couldn't change, but his instincts told him otherwise. Unable to shake the unease, he closed the laptop and sat down at his desk. He needed to get control of his thoughts. The logical part of his brain insisted that everything had a simple explanation. Maybe he was just spooked by the encounter in the park. The dream was just his subconscious processing the fear. But deep down, James knew it wasn't that simple. Something had changed. And it wasn't just the photo. It was him. For the rest of the night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. He felt her presence lurking in the corners of his apartment, just out of sight but always watching. The emptiness inside him had grown, filling every part of him with a gnawing sense of dread. By dawn, James knew there was no escaping it. The Lady of Shadows wasn't just a legend. She was real. And now, she was part of his life. James hadn't anticipated how fast his life would spiral after that night. The unease that had started as a subtle, gnawing anxiety soon exploded into something far darker and far more tangible. The next morning, he went through the motions of preparing the photo for submission to his editor at the magazine. His fingers moved mechanically across the keyboard as he typed out a brief description of the image, avoiding the deeper implications of what he had witnessed. The Lady of Shadows was still just a legend to everyone else. But as he stared at her in the photo, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was more than a myth. Later that afternoon, he sent the article off with a click. A moment of hesitation flashed through him as his cursor hovered over the send button, but the rational part of his brain overruled the instinctual fear. He needed this story. He needed to prove that the legend had substance. But after he sent the email, something changed. His apartment, usually a sanctuary of warmth and light, felt oppressive, as though the very air had thickened, weighing down on him. Shadows seemed to crawl across the walls in ways they hadn't before, elongating unnaturally, stretching into grotesque, formless figures. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, tried to rationalize it away as a trick of light, anything other than what it seemed to be. That night, as he lay in bed, James found himself unable to sleep. His mind was a cacophony of images, none more powerful than the blackened eyes of the Lady of Shadows. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against his window made him jump. The sensation of being watched, of not being alone, grew unbearable. Around 3 a.m., a faint sound caught his attention. It was barely audible at first, like a distant hum. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder. James strained to listen, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The sound was coming from the corner of his bedroom, a soft, rhythmic tapping, as if someone or something was knocking on the floor. James sat up, his throat tight, sweat beading on his forehead. He stared into the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to twist and swirl unnaturally. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. His breath quickened as the realization hit him. It was coming from within the shadows. Summoning every ounce of courage, he grabbed his phone from the nightstand and switched on the flashlight, aiming it toward the dark corner. The beam sliced through the shadows, illuminating the space where the sound had been coming from. Nothing. The room was empty. Relief washed over him for a brief moment until the knocking began again. This time, it was louder, closer. The shadows on the wall danced as though alive, and then, just for an instant, he saw it. A figure, vague, spectral, lurking in the darkness. A figure dressed in white. James's stomach twisted into knots as the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the presence in the room lingered. He could feel it. She was here. The Lady of Shadows had followed him. The dread that had been gnawing at him now exploded into full-blown terror. He couldn't stay in the apartment. He had to get out. James grabbed his coat, phone, and camera bag and bolted from his apartment without a second thought. The city outside was alive with its usual nocturnal hum, but the sound offered little comfort. He darted down the street, moving aimlessly, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The cold air stung his lungs, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. His footsteps eventually led him back to the one place he should have avoided, the park. Central Park loomed in front of him, the iron gates creaking in the wind. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but something drew him forward, as if an invisible force was pulling him into the heart of the legend itself. The park was eerily silent, the usual sounds of nightlife and the occasional late jogger conspicuously absent. The trees seemed taller, their branches stretching toward him like skeletal fingers. James swallowed hard as he ventured deeper, the flashlight on his phone flickering weakly in the oppressive darkness. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the spot where he had seen her the night before. The clearing was exactly as he remembered it, except now it felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a palpable tension that made his skin crawl. Suddenly, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and with it came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, approaching from behind. James spun around, heart in his throat, but no one was there. The footsteps continued, circling him, as though something unseen was stalking him through the trees. His grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles white with fear. He moved the flashlight in every direction, but it only revealed the dark, empty park. Then he heard it, her voice. A soft, whispering sound, carried on the wind. His blood ran cold as the voice grew louder, echoing all around him. You shouldn't have taken the picture. James's heart pounded in his chest. His breath came in shallow gasps as the words echoed through his mind. It was her. The Lady of Shadows. She was here, closer than ever. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. Panic surged through him as he fumbled with the phone, trying desperately to turn it back on. But before he could, a soft, cold hand touched the back of his neck. He froze, his entire body stiff with fear. Slowly, he turned around, dread clawing at his insides. There, standing just inches from him, was the Lady of Shadows. Her eyes, black as the void, locked onto his. James wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. Her cold, dead eyes held him captive, and in that moment, he felt the emptiness inside him grow until it consumed everything. The last thing he saw before his vision went black was her twisted smile. When James woke up hours later, he was lying in the middle of the park. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows over the landscape. His head throbbed, and his mind was a foggy mess. He couldn't remember how he had gotten there or what had happened. But the cold emptiness remained, deeper than ever. And then he remembered the photo. The article. The Lady of Shadows. He scrambled to his feet and ran home, desperate to delete the evidence. But when he got to his apartment, his computer screen was already glowing. The photo of the Lady of Shadows was open, but now the image was warped. Her figure had twisted into something monstrous, her face contorted into a hideous grin. But worse than that was the email notification flashing on the screen. His editor had published the article. James stared at the screen in horror, realizing too late what he had done. The Lady of Shadows had warned him, but he hadn't listened. And now, she was free. James's life unraveled swiftly after the article went live. He had expected praise from his editor, maybe even some public interest in the mysterious figure haunting Central Park. But instead, something much darker began to take hold. It started subtly, with whispers. At first, James thought they were just tricks of his exhausted mind. He hadn't slept well in days, ever since that night in the park. The relentless buzzing of his phone, filled with messages from readers and colleagues, only added to his frazzled state. Most messages were curious, some even excited about the photograph, but there were a few that unnerved him, people claiming to have seen the Lady of Shadows themselves, or worse, warning him that his article had awakened something ancient. The whispers grew louder with each passing day. They followed him everywhere, creeping into his thoughts like a shadow he couldn't shake. He'd walk down the bustling streets of New York, and amidst the clamor of the city, he'd hear it, his name, spoken in a soft, chilling voice, as if the wind itself were calling to him. You shouldn't have taken the picture. It would echo in the most unexpected moments, freezing him in place. On the subway, in line at a coffee shop, or even in the brief silence of his apartment, the voice would return. No matter how hard he tried to shake it off, the whispers lingered. But the worst came at night. James had always been a deep sleeper, someone who could crash into bed after a long day and drift off without issue. But since that night in the park, sleep had become a cruel game. He would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, hearing faint tapping noises or the soft rustle of curtains, even when the windows were shut. And when he did manage to drift off, the nightmares came. In every dream, the Lady of Shadows was there, standing at the foot of his bed, her black eyes boring into his soul. He'd wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, her voice still echoing in his ears. Each time, he would check his camera, his phone, his computer, anything that had captured her image. But the photos were always there, unchanged, though they now felt more like a curse than a prize. One evening, after days of relentless paranoia, James decided to take matters into his own hands. He needed to talk to someone. Anyone might help him understand what was happening. He remembered an old contact from the magazine, a paranormal investigator named Isaac Warren. Warren had written for niche blogs and conducted private investigations into urban legends and ghost sightings around the city. If anyone could help, it was him. James met Warren at a small, dimly lit bar on the Lower East Side. The investigator was an older man, his face weathered from years of chasing ghosts and rumors. He had a reputation for digging too deep into the unknown, and it showed in the way his eyes darted nervously around the room, as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. "So, you saw her?" Warren asked in a hushed tone, leaning forward across the table. James nodded, taking a sip of his whiskey to steady his nerves. "I got the photo. The article went live a few days ago. But now, something's happening. I can't sleep. I keep hearing things, seeing her in my dreams." His voice faltered. I think she's following me." Warren's expression grew grim. He pulled a small notebook from his coat and began scribbling notes, occasionally glancing up at James. "You should never have taken that photo, James. The Lady of Shadows isn't just a legend. She's tied to the park in ways no one fully understands. People who get too close to her, they don't come back the same." James felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do you mean?" Warren sighed, his hand tightening around the pen. "She's an old spirit, older than the park itself. Some say she was a victim of a tragedy centuries ago. Others think she's a manifestation of the park's darker history. But every time someone tries to capture her image or dig too deep, things go wrong. Memories fade, people lose themselves, and sometimes they disappear entirely." James's stomach nodded. He had heard urban legends before, but this felt different, more real, more dangerous. "What do I do?" he asked, desperation lacing his words. Warren closed the notebook and leaned back, his gaze piercing. "There's only one thing you can do: destroy the photo. Every copy, every backup. She's tied to it now, and the longer that image exists, the more power she'll have over you." James sat in silence, absorbing the weight of Warren's words. Destroy the photo? The idea seemed impossible. It had already been published online, sent to multiple outlets. It was out there for the world to see. Could he even erase it at this point? But he had no choice. That night, back in his apartment, James frantically scoured his files, deleting every trace of the photograph he could find. He wiped his hard drive, erased his camera's memory card, and took down the article from the magazine's website. But as he sat in front of his computer, staring at the blank screen, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The photo had already been shared, copied, and seen by thousands. The damage was done. As the clock ticked past midnight, the oppressive weight in the air returned. The familiar sensation of being watched prickled the back of his neck. James's hands trembled as he turned off his computer and shut off the lights. Maybe, just maybe, if he acted quickly enough, he could stop this nightmare. But then, as he stepped away from his desk, he heard it again, the soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than ever. James's heart raced as he slowly turned toward the sound. The shadows shifted, and there, standing in the dim light, was the Lady of Shadows. Her black eyes glistened with a malevolent gleam, and her twisted smile widened as she stepped closer. James backed away, his breath shallow, his mind racing. He had done everything Warren had said, erased the photo, deleted the article. But it wasn't enough. She was still here. And she wasn't going to let him go. James's world began to collapse as the presence of the Lady of Shadows grew more persistent, more tangible. Each night, her figure lingered in the darkest corners of his apartment, always just out of reach, watching, waiting. His sleep, already fragile, disintegrated into fragments of restless hours haunted by her black eyes. He no longer knew if he was awake or dreaming. The boundary between reality and nightmare had dissolved entirely. It wasn't just the nights that she claimed. The days, once James's sanctuary from the horrors of the dark, became filled with terror. The whispers followed him everywhere, on the streets, in coffee shops, even at his desk. It didn't matter how loud the city roared around him. The lady's soft, chilling voice always cut through the noise, reminding him that she was never far behind. "James, come closer," she whispered, her voice like the wind, brushing against his ear. It was always a trap, pulling him deeper into paranoia. His mind fractured more with each whisper, his thoughts becoming erratic, scattered. Desperation led him to seek out Isaac Warren again, hoping for some new guidance. But when he arrived at Warren's office, the man was gone, disappeared, as if he had never existed. The place was abandoned, dust collecting on Warren's old files and paranormal equipment. James searched for hours, digging through papers and notebooks, but there was nothing. It was as though Warren had never been real, a figment of his unraveling mind. That night, as James sat alone in his apartment, his paranoia reached a fever pitch. He locked every window, bolted every door, convinced that this would keep her out. But deep down, he knew it was futile. She wasn't something you could lock out. She was already inside. The tapping began again, rhythmic and slow, like a heartbeat. James froze. His breath caught in his throat as the shadows in his apartment shifted. She was here. He could feel her cold presence spreading through the room. Desperation turned to action. Grabbing the closest object, a heavy lamp from his desk, James swung it wildly at the shadows. "Leave me alone," he screamed, his voice hoarse and raw from days of torment. The lamp crashed against the wall, shattering on impact. The room fell into darkness, except for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. The tapping stopped. For a moment, James thought it was over. Maybe he had driven her away. But then, from the corner of his vision, he saw her again, the Lady of Shadows, standing motionless, her twisted smile more terrifying than ever. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her presence was enough to send him spiraling into terror. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, backing away until he was pressed against the wall, his body trembling uncontrollably. "I erased it. I deleted everything," James cried out, his voice cracking. But it didn't matter. She was bound to him now, and there was no undoing what he had done. The next few days passed in a blur of terror and confusion. James barely left his apartment, surviving on scraps of food and what little water he could force down. His body weakened as his mind began to splinter, reality twisting into a grotesque nightmare. The walls of his apartment seemed to close in on him, and the lady's presence never left his side. She didn't need to speak anymore, her silence was far more haunting. On the 5th night after meeting with Warren, James broke. He couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the constant watching, the feeling that his mind was unraveling, it was too much. He needed to escape, to get out, to run. But even as he stumbled out of his apartment, disheveled and broken, he knew deep down there was nowhere to run. The streets of New York were alive with their usual chaos, but to James, it all felt distant, like he was walking through a dream. He moved like a ghost, unnoticed by the crowds around him, his eyes darting to every shadow, every dark alley, every flickering streetlight. She was following him, he could feel it. Central Park loomed in the distance, a dark, foreboding place in the night. Against every instinct, James found himself drawn to it. He knew he should stay away, that returning to the park where this nightmare had begun would only make things worse. But it was as if an invisible force was pulling him back, guiding him through the park's winding paths and under its ancient trees. And then, there she was. The Lady of Shadows, standing at the edge of the lake, her figure illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. She looked almost peaceful, standing there in her white dress, her eyes locked onto his. But James knew better. He knew what lurked beneath that serene facade. He didn't know why he approached her. His legs moved on their own, like a puppet on strings. Each step brought him closer to her, and with each step, he felt his mind slipping further into madness. "Why won't you leave me alone?" James whispered, his voice barely audible. But the lady didn't respond. She only smiled. And then, in a moment of clarity, James realized something terrifying. She wasn't here to haunt him. She was here to claim him. As the night deepened and the city's lights faded into the background, James's body trembled uncontrollably. He fell to his knees in front of the Lady of Shadows, his mind a chaotic mess of fear, confusion, and despair. This was it. There was no escape. No one could save him now. The silence in Central Park was oppressive. James knelt before the Lady of Shadows, feeling her gaze pierce through him, like icy fingers gripping his mind. Time itself seemed to stretch, as if the universe was waiting for something to snap. The usual sounds of the city, traffic, distant voices, the hum of New York life, were muffled, and all James could hear was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. She didn't move. She didn't speak. The Lady of Shadows simply stood there, watching him with that same eerie smile, her dark eyes reflecting the pale light of the moon. The world felt distant, fading around him as her presence became all-encompassing. James realized in that moment what he had failed to grasp before. She wasn't just an apparition. She was a force, an ancient, malevolent entity. And she had chosen him. A gust of wind cut through the trees, rustling the leaves, but the lady remained still, untouched by the movement around them. James wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stay frozen in this nightmare. Yet his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed, trapped in her gaze, as if the very air had thickened and weighed him down. In his mind, fragments of his past began to unravel. Memories of childhood, of his first camera, of the days when photography was a passion rather than a profession, they all began to blur, fading into obscurity. His identity, the core of who he was slipping away. The lady was taking it from him, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the hollow shell of a man. Suddenly, her voice broke the silence. It was a soft, melodic whisper, barely audible over the wind, but it cut through James like a blade. "You sought me," she said, "and now you belong to me." With a rush of panic, James tried to break free. He stumbled backward, scrambling to his feet, his legs shaky and unsteady. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he turned and ran, his mind screaming for him to escape. But no matter how fast he moved, he could feel her presence closing in on him, like a shadow that stretched and expanded, engulfing everything in its path. He sprinted through the park, his feet pounding against the earth. Trees blurred by, the dim lamps barely lighting the way, but it didn't matter. He wasn't running from something physical, he was running from something far more terrifying. Something he couldn't see, couldn't touch, but knew was always just a step behind. His lungs burned with the effort, his legs weakening with each stride, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every dark corner seemed to whisper her name, every shadow reaching out to pull him back. James's vision began to tunnel, his mind cracking under the strain. The park, the city, the world itself, all of it felt distorted, as if reality was bending under the weight of her power. And then, just as his legs were about to give out, he reached the park's exit. He stumbled into the street, almost collapsing as he gasped for breath. The lights of passing cars and the hum of the city hit him like a wave, momentarily breaking the spell that had gripped him in the park. James looked around, disoriented, as people passed by, oblivious to his terror. He was free. For the moment. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The Lady of Shadows had claimed him, and no matter how far he ran, she would always find him. Days passed, but James's sanity deteriorated rapidly. The image of the lady haunted his every waking moment. He couldn't close his eyes without seeing her, couldn't sleep without hearing her voice. He stopped going to work, stopped answering calls, stopped everything. His apartment became a prison, the walls closing in as the shadows grew darker, longer. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, became sinister. Each moment was a reminder that she was waiting for him. He barely ate, barely slept. His body wasted away, and the man who had once been a confident, driven photographer was now a shell of his former self, hollowed out by fear. In a moment of desperation, James tried to destroy the photo. He found the original print, staring at the haunting silhouette of the lady, and tore it apart, shredding it into pieces. But it didn't matter. The image was burned into his mind. No matter how many times he destroyed the evidence, it was already too late. He even tried reaching out for help, but every attempt ended in failure. No one believed him. Friends distanced themselves, thinking he had lost his mind. The few colleagues who still spoke to him couldn't understand the depth of his fear, attributing his behavior to overwork or a breakdown. One night, after days without sleep, James made his way to the only place left where he thought he could find answers, the Central Park Lake, where it had all begun. In the dead of night, he stood by the water's edge, staring at his reflection, hoping for some revelation, some clue as to how to escape. But instead, the lady appeared behind him in the water's reflection, her dark eyes gleaming. "You cannot run," she whispered. "You belong to me." James was found the next morning by joggers, muttering incoherently by the lake. His clothes were soaked, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't resist when they called for help, and when the paramedics arrived, he was taken away quietly. They said he was raving about shadows, about a woman in white, about something in the park that was coming for him. He was admitted to a psychiatric hospital under heavy sedation. The doctors said it was a severe case of psychosis brought on by stress and trauma. But James knew the truth. He knew she was still watching, still waiting for him in the darkness. No one could save him now. Years later, James's story had become a whispered legend, a cautionary tale shared among journalists, photographers, and anyone who dared to chase after the unknown. They called it the curse of the Central Park photographer. Some dismissed it as urban myth, while others, especially those in the photography circles, spoke of it in hushed tones, fearing they might attract the same fate. But for me, it was more than just a story. I had followed the case for years, haunted by the strange details and the eerie parallels with other disappearances in the area. As an investigator for paranormal phenomena, my work often led me to the darkest corners of human experience. And the case of James Marlowe was one that refused to let go. The night he was found in Central Park, raving and half mad, marked the beginning of something larger than just one man's descent into madness. It was the culmination of years of whispered sightings of the Lady of Shadows, and James's photo, the one he had published just days before his breakdown, was the closest anyone had ever come to capturing her image. I remember the first time I saw it. It was haunting, blurry yet unmistakably human, a silhouette draped in white standing beneath a twisted tree in the park. It drew me in like nothing else. There was something about the way her form seemed to blend into the night, something unnatural in the way the shadows bent around her. James had believed that publishing the photo would bring him closure, but it had done the opposite. Once the image was out in the world, it was as if the lady herself had been unleashed. I had tracked down every person who had seen the photo, and many of them reported the same things: strange dreams, memory lapses, and an overwhelming sense of emptiness, as if part of their soul had been siphoned away. The hospital staff told me James had never been the same. He spent his days staring blankly at the walls, occasionally whispering about shadows and eyes that followed him wherever he went. He refused visitors, and over time, most people forgot about him. But I couldn't. It was a rainy afternoon when I decided to visit him. The hospital was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I made my way down the long corridor to James's room, where I found him sitting by the window, his eyes distant, fixed on something only he could see. He didn't react when I entered. His face was gaunt, his hair unkempt, but his hands trembled as they gripped the arms of the chair. I sat down across from him, placing a copy of the photograph on the table between us. "James," I said quietly, "I need to know the truth. Who is she?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, his eyes flickered to the photo. His mouth opened, dry and cracked, but the words that came out were barely more than a whisper. "She's always been here, watching, waiting," he said, his voice weak. "You can't escape her. I thought I could capture her, expose her, but she's part of this place. Part of all of us." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I pressed on. "The others who've seen her, why do they forget?" He looked at me then, truly looked at me for the first time. His eyes were filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost unbearable. "Because forgetting is a mercy," he said. "She takes away what we fear the most, our memories, our sense of self. But what's left is worse. The emptiness. It eats at you." I leaned forward, feeling the weight of his words. "And the photo?" James shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "The photo doesn't matter. It never did. She's already in your head. She's part of you now." My heart raced as the implications sank in. Was that true? Had I already been marked by her just by investigating, by looking into this too deeply? I stood up, feeling a growing unease. "Thank you, James," I said, turning to leave. "I hope you find peace." But as I reached the door, his voice stopped me cold. "You won't," he said. "She'll come for you too." A few months passed after that day. I thought I could move on, put the case behind me. But the more I tried to forget, the more the shadows seemed to cling to me. I began to dream of her. In the dark corners of my mind, she was always there, standing beneath that twisted tree, her eyes locking with mine. Then, one night, I woke up in a cold sweat, only to find the photograph lying on my bedside table. I had locked it away, or so I thought, but there it was, as if it had placed itself there, waiting for me to remember. I knew, deep down, that James was right. The Lady of Shadows had chosen me next. As I sit here now, writing this, I can feel her presence growing stronger. The lights flicker, and the shadows stretch just a little too long. My thoughts are becoming hazy, my memories slipping away, and I'm left with that same terrible emptiness James spoke of. Maybe this story will serve as a warning, or maybe it's already too late. The Lady of Shadows doesn't care about your skepticism. She's real, and once you've seen her, there's no escaping her grasp. If you're reading this, ask yourself one thing: could this be real? Or have you already seen her too?
If you want to watch another story, there is another video appearing on your screen now. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling stories.